Morning. Hey, Mark.
Good morning.
Hey, other angry dog. Imperious, we might get to your question. We might. No promises, but we might. Ari, good morning. Angry dog, good morning. What do we have going? What do we got on board? It's me again, obviously, every day. Necessary. She says, or I say she, I'm implying that it's me again as a she. I found a PDF of Camp of the Saints on the interwebs. It's amazing. Email it. Hey, Don. I think you probably thought there was going to be an emoji there, but there's not. Mark, good morning.
Good morning. Great to be with you this morning.
Yeah, thank you for joining. We were talking a little bit before the stream, and I'm always wary of sort of hiding the best stuff from the live audience, right? But for those of you who are not familiar with Mark Meckler is what I would consider one of our OG guests on the long form from Norm and my long form days, which aren't so long ago, just maybe a couple of years, but time is passing fairly quickly. But Mark, you are an attorney. You're a Texas man. You're a family man, father, husband. You're a lawyer. You are the president of what's known as the Convention of States Project, an Article 5 project under the United States Constitution. We'll get into that kind of stuff. You spoke with us, man, some time ago. I can't even remember now the date, but when I was looking through possibilities for guest hosts towards the latter part of this week, your name is at the top of the list. Obviously, last week we had First Amendment attorney Mark Randazza come on and spend some time doing what we called Freaky Speech Friday because it was Friday the 13th. This week, I'm really excited to get into a concept that is near and dear to me, but is also really difficult for me, is sort of complicated, which is federalism, right? What creates that perfect union? So, Mark, thank you for being here. Welcome to Law and Legitimacy. And you can introduce yourself a little bit if you want. I don't want to dominate that part.
Yeah, I'd love to. I mean, I think you did the best summary that there could be. I am an unlikely participant in politics. I was a lawyer. That was what I was trained to do. I did real estate and business law, and then internet law back in the early days of the internet. I'm pretty old. And so that was kind of my legal and professional background. I'm an entrepreneur by passion. I love building things. I stumbled into politics in 2009 during what was called the Tea Party movement. Younger people may not remember that, but
I do vaguely though. So I was, so 2007, you said 2009,
2009. Yeah.
So I was just graduating high school. So the branding of the Tea Party is familiar, but the substance of that was not until I met you.
Well, so I mean, it's stuff that your listeners, your viewers will relate to. Basically, the premise was the federal government had grown out of control, and we were just trying to reassert the Constitution, free market principles, simple stuff that most Americans believe in. In 2010, that led to the largest swing in Congress since 1938. Went Democrat to Republican. By the way, I'm not a Republican. I resigned party membership about, 15 years ago because I felt like the Republican Party didn't represent my values any longer. So anyway, we swung the Congress dramatically to the right, and I expected everything to change, and nothing changed. The Uniparty went on as we would expect, and as I would now expect, and did all the same things, didn't do the stuff that we fought for. And so I was pretty disillusioned. And that's how I stumbled into this idea of calling a convention of states. I met Mike Ferris, who is a constitutional attorney at the highest level, who he founded the homeschool movement in America. He founded Patrick Henry College. And then when we met, he said that I was approaching the incorrect problem. He said, you think we have a personnel problem in DC. We really have a structure problem. This goes to federalism. If we don't fix that structure problem, you can put as many good people as you want in DC, define that however you want. They're all going to do essentially the same thing. We got a broken system. We've broken our system of federalism. And the way to fix it is to call a convention of states. That's in Article 5 of the Constitution. It says when 2/3 of the states want to gather and express that through their state legislatures, we can gather. And specifically, the purposes we're doing it for is to take power from the federal government and give it back to the people and the states. Let the states be the states, which takes us to the primary area of conversation we want to have is federalism.
Right. Well, let's not rush into it too much here. Don McNeil asks, what happened to all of those Tea Party orgs?
Yeah, I would say what happened was two things. I think the Tea Party movement was successful. And even though I just said that DC didn't change it all, if you look at the nature of political movements, and I'm now leading or one of the leaders of what I would describe as the second political movement in my lifetime, the successful ones go away. I mean, this is kind of odd. You would think, well, no, they're going to be here forever. They're successful.
Well, no, it is perfectly intuitive to me. So my primary area of practice when I'm not, talking to people who are much more successful and impactful than I am is doing battle with the administrative state, right? I'm a transactional attorney. I represent clients that deal in trades and industries that are regulated federally, at the state level, et cetera. And it is not lost on me that there are certain public policy objectives that predate the formation of these agencies, right? There were certain ends that we as a collective decided were important to protect the consumer, to protect our way of life, and our health. But we've gotten to a point where it's almost like everything's got a gluten allergy, to make this very millennial for you. Everything is inflamed and not moving. There's this perma state of sort of questionable quasi competence, right? And as such, the budgets for these entities and these agencies continue to grow with inflation or with the next sort of project that they want to take on. To me, the formation of these agencies, I think maybe perhaps part of what convention of states might do at the federal level is propose that there needs to be some sort of predetermined end date or expiration of the formation of these agencies, because most people don't realize from a separation of powers perspective, the formation of these agencies, which most times are answerable to the executive branch, are a creation of Congress, of our legislature, and are a delegation of those duties to a different body, a different organ. And that means that our rights, the people that we have elected to represent our interests, to advocate for our interests in the legislature, over time have delegated and abrogated their responsibility to keep a constant eye on these things. And you have this fourth, what is often called the fourth branch of government, right? The administrative state out there, right? So I think that Don's question is great, saying, what happened to those Tea Party orgs? They did what they were supposed to do, right? They got in, they did their job, and then they left, right?
Well, look, and I think movements that don't do this become cancerous on the body politic. And I'll give you an example of movements that don't do it. I would argue that the labor movement in the United States largely has become a cancer on the body politic. When the labor movement began in the United States, I would argue if I was around, I would have been a labor organizer. I mean, when you look at the way workers were treated, the danger of their conditions, the literally basically subhuman pay, there's no way anybody could survive on this. Families were starving. The abuse of corporations was so severe by modern standards that people had to organize. And so these labor unions did that. They built up all kinds of stuff for the workers, reasonable pay, pensions, safe working conditions. Now they're essentially large extortion machines, and they are destroying industry. They've driven industry from the United States of America. I think you see the UAW now asking for a 4-day work.
You took it right out of my mouth. We've been covering that strike on previous streams, and I've said a lot. I think the last thing I said about it was just really a sort of a joke, is listening to Ford or any of these executives of the big three tell the union that they can't afford to pay the union workers the wages they're demanding to be paid. I find that perfectly reasonable, because if you just look at the Ford website right now, who is going to buy an EV Mustang, Mark? It's atrocious.
That's an abomination. I have to say, in particular, I am offended by the EV Mustang.
I'm offended by any classic. I'm offended by any late '60s classic American muscle car that has been diluted down to a V6, now to an EV. That's the way I approach these things.
Yeah,
So
I'm
I
with
already
you.
have problems with the former. Now we've got real issues with the latter, but earnestly, sometimes these things aren't that complicated. So I know we're laughing about it, but if you look at the product that Ford and these other companies are now putting out into the marketplace, right? Prices are higher than they've ever been, but are people attracted to the purchase, right? Are they sold on the proposition of EV? No. Are they sold on the aesthetics of what the American manufacturers, not named Tesla, are putting out into that sector? Absolutely not. So to me, looking at this UAW stuff, and we did some background on how the Biden administration via the DOJ actually had a monitor based on some sort of settlement that was it was when he was vice president, and the influence of this administration on the UAW and that sector with respect to EV is hard to miss. So sorry, that was a quick aside, but that is exactly the type of thing that I was thinking of when we were talking about that.
Yeah, and so we see this in almost all cases. When a movement becomes permanent, it becomes toxic. So in the case of the Tea Party, to circle back to the question, what happened was the people who were productive Tea Partiers, quote unquote, went on to do other things. Some of them ran for office. They're within our system of government now. Some of them became campaign managers, campaign consultants. Some of them just went back to their normal productive lives. We had done what we came to do, which we actually changed the narrative. I think there's two, I would say, failures of the Tea Party movement. One is that we actually didn't have a plan. And I say that as one of the leaders. Look, all I thought was if you elect good people, then things go right. And that didn't happen. Now I understand that as an eighth grade civics version of American politics. That's all I knew. The second I would say that we did wrong was that, and these two things kind of fit together, the specifics were missing, right? And so electing people to do what? And I said, fidelity to the Constitution, free market, stuff like that. What does that mean? And we talked about federalism, again, going back to your original theme. We didn't work to impose federalism on the government. And these were things we needed to do. But most of the people who I consider were the good, productive Tea Partiers, they're still out there. They're engaged in politics at every level. We trained up a new generation of folks in politics. I think we're reaching the tail end of that. I'm 61 years old. I was 50, roughly 48 when this started. And so those people are starting to age out of politics. The new Tea Party movement, by the way, in America is what I would call the parents' revolution of 2020.
Wow.
And you got all these people coming into the political marketplace. They're going to have a much longer tail than the Tea Party movement had.
Well, and I think that history has shown. There was already a comment in the Rumble chat, which, by the way, hello to Haley. Haley is there.
Hey, Haley.
But there was a comment in the Rumble chat that pointed out the Obama administration's weaponization of the IRS against the Tea Party. And I think that absolutely. And I think that when we think about the modern version of that, the connection that you just made, the corollary being the parents' revolution, we have seen the way that this administration has persecuted and labeled those who are showing up to school board meetings, those who are asking for accountability over the methods and the substance of these curriculum for their students. All of a sudden, it seems as though the Department of Justice is being weaponized in a manner not different from the way the IRS was. Different mechanism, same pressure. Saying that the people who want to advocate for their own individual rights are terrorists, effectively, right? But just I want to, so we could pull back a little bit from, and we'll jump back in. There's a story that you didn't even remember, but we should, because we're here on Law and Legitimacy. This is a Norm Pattis show. Norm is doing his West Coast wandering. He'll return sometime, whenever he feels like it, and it'll be soon. I promise. Don't read into that. And I'm always reminded of the chance encounter. I will never forget the text message that I got from Norm saying, "Hey, contact this guy. He said he'll come on and we can interview him." And I'll let you tell the story of your meeting with Norm Pattis for the first time.
Yeah, I mean, I travel a lot, and I spend half my life on airplanes, and I rarely, if ever, talk to anybody sitting next to me. And it's a chance for me to get some quiet time. I'm generally working or reading when I'm on an airplane. I'm not getting pounded with texts or phone calls or whatever. So I'm generally pretty antisocial on airplanes. And so I sat down next to Norm, and your viewers, if they've watched for any amount of time, they know what Norm looks like. And I looked next to me and I saw this guy in John Lennon glasses and a
Hey, what does that
ponytail.
mean? What Norm looks like? I'm just kidding. Norm
Look,
is a
he
he's like
looked like
blonde.
a
Yeah,
I
he's a
for
hippie.
me, he looked like a Berkeley professor is
Yeah,
how
yeah, yeah, that's exactly right. Maybe
right? And
Yale,
so
Columbia.
that's sort of that would be in the political world. If things went as the book goes by its cover, that would be my nemesis.
Mhm.
Right. And so I sat down and I looked at him. I feel so bad saying this, a little bit of disdain, like, oh God, not another one of these guys. And so I sit down and I don't remember what he was reading. Maybe you do, but he was reading something that didn't fit that, like something
Great,
conservative.
man. That really tests my my memory.
Do you
I'll think
remember?
about it. I'll see if I can summon that.
Okay, so he's reading something, and I'm looking at what he's reading. I'm thinking, that doesn't fit. I
Was
don't
it
understand.
Deaths of Despair? It wasn't that, was it? No.
No, no. And it was something it was something fairly esoteric. It wasn't like some obvious mainstream right wing screed, but it was something that normally somebody who was radically of the left would not be reading. And so I remember looking at that and I was so curious. I remember just looking at him and say, "Hey, that's a great book." And he said, "Yeah, it is." And I wanted to demonstrate that I actually knew what it was. I forget again what it was, but I started naming some of the concepts out of the book, and so suddenly we were engaged in this conversation, and it was one of the highlight conversations of my life because I think Norm's. I mean, number one, he's a legal giant. Like, I had no idea, right? So I didn't realize I'm sitting next to some very
Yeah,
serious legal giant, somebody
big
who's
Norm.
done
Yeah.
incredible things in the legal profession. He starts naming some cases. Well, I know the cases, and I didn't know they were his cases. And so then we realized that we've got all this stuff in common. We talked the entire flight. I never let him go back to his book. I was probably one of those guys. He got off the plane thinking, oh my God, I can't believe that guy wouldn't let me read.
Yeah. Well, I love that. It gives me chills thinking about that because of how random life can be. And your presence here on this stream this morning is a derivative of that chance encounter on a plane, right? And the two of you acknowledging some overlap in interest in what you read and what you consume and your view of the world and the way that you conduct yourself. Certainly, it doesn't matter that Norm was who he is. From the perspective of you loving the book, but it led you to, so of course Norm would be reading that book, right? In retrospect of someone of his caliber. I love sharing that just because, I am so early in my career. I think it's, most people, I think Mark Randazza said, I don't consider you to be a really young attorney anymore. And I'm like, I don't know, man. This isn't the NBA or the NFL, right? I'm 33. I've got quite a ways to travel here in terms of a legal career. That arc doesn't really start until like 40s, from what I can tell. And so I'm humbled to have you, Mark, even tertiarily in my life by virtue of Norm. I always talk about how grateful and humbled I am by being able to work with Norm. But I think that the synthesis of these ideas and what we're able to talk about, I just wanted to give 2 seconds for people to have a slight window sort of behind the scenes to see how the hell do any of these people know each other. And that story is it. That's it. There's nothing more, nothing less, right?
Yeah, look, I think there's a piece that really matters here. One is my failure in just judging somebody because I sat down and I looked the way that. And by the way, I of all people should know better than this because I had a blue mohawk in law school, right?
I
So
remember that story.
yeah, so I should know way better than that. But also just to talk to Norm and understand where Norm came from and the arc of his political thinking, and to know that, and also to know that he still holds all the same values he's always held, right? The world has sort of changed around Norm, and Norm has continued to hold the same freedom and liberty values that he's always held. The world has shifted sides on Norm. Norm has not shifted sides, I would
That's
argue.
absolutely the truth. And I think that what if anything, and I can't speak for him, but from my observation and just the conversations we have both publicly and privately, I think that what I would suggest is that his challenge is acknowledging that the support for his ideas, the source of the support for his ideas has changed in a corresponding way. So sometimes it's difficult to recognize allies out in the wild
Right.
because of that shift in the Overton window that you referenced, right?
Yep.
You know,
Yeah, I would
Norm
agree with
is one of those. Norm learned from the pioneer of 1983 litigation, right?
that. Right.
Pearson qualified immunity. He has brought cases and changed precedent at a national level. He's done really impressive things that young attorneys should aspire for. But similar to the comparison to being in the NBA, that is the top 0.00001% of all people that'll ever pick up a basketball.
Right.
Norm is in that tier of attorney. And so it's what I love about Norm is his ability to be down to earth and be able to have a conversation and recognize these things, but also perform at such an elite level. Um, I want to use that as a basis for getting into federalism, because Norm's preoccupation with criminal defense, particularly due process, is what has given him the opportunity to flourish in the way that he has. But that emphasis on due process recognizes something really fundamental to the U.S. Constitution, which is that right to a trial, right? The right to face your adversaries and your accusers, right? And also to be presumed innocent until proven guilty, right? There are all these very fundamental things at an individual level. What many people skip when they think about individual versus the state is the fact that there are 3 levels ultimately to that, right? Or maybe even more, but we're going to skip the hyper local stuff for now. States have their own sovereignty, right? As in fact, a precondition for our union, right? A more perfect union, United States of America. Well, it required a lot of Texas, right? And we talked with Adam Ellwanger yesterday, and he knows quite a lot about how difficult it was for Texas to make the decision to join the United States, right? And in fact, it was that state sovereignty that was a non-starter. If it were not there, there's nothing to talk about. When we think about the 10th Amendment, those powers that are reserved for the states, and we think about the powers that we have explicitly given to the federal government, and then we look at, say, the state of Texas for purposes of example, and the migrant crisis, right? The southern border, the immigration crisis that our country is now seeing in real time on every TV screen, every device, in every paper, publication, et cetera. We are seeing the results of that. We're seeing Governor Greg Abbott and some of his sort of de facto allies in other states busing migrants into major municipalities known for being very Democrat dominated, and putting this crisis into their yard, right? To say, this is what you've abdicated in terms of your duty to us down here. We are going to likewise show you the consequences of what happens, right? Now you have real people to deal with. You have real humans to deal with, not just an idea of one or an idea of a group of them. What we've learned from, and I'll bring the article up just to use it as a helpful supplement for us, but Adam Ellwanger published the article in The American Mind, How to Turn a Cold War Hot. And in that article, it does a bit of a historical analysis of the preconditions for the Civil War. And I don't want to focus so much on that as sort of, this is going to turn kinetic, but more about the philosophy behind the conditions for revolution, right? Norm has talked about it for 1776. What were those conditions for revolution that the colonists finally said, look, these, we are at this point. It is now a requirement that we either put up or shut up, kind of thing. With the Civil War, different dynamics, but the comparison made here, and I talked a little bit about that on the stream yesterday, is that Abraham Lincoln made observations that the southern states at that time simply would not accept, right? There was a clear impasse. And it seems as though that Texas is now in the position of the Union states of yore, right? And that's just my words. It's not Adam's words, but my insight on what he's writing is that the dynamics have shifted, right? Such that there is a federal ruling class that has a clear policy with respect to immigration that is unpopular as it gets with the members of the states that are impacted the most. Can you talk just about living in Texas, how life has changed there politically and culturally, and then what the 10th Amendment even means in 2023? And we will eventually, I promise, get to what Convention of the States and the Article 5 project is doing about it. But if you will, just as a Texan, talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, and I want to back up even one step further. I think this is really important because we started and we keep referring to that concept of federalism. And so I want people to understand exactly what federalism is and why it was so important historically in the country. I'm actually writing a book about this right now about the country coming apart. The working title is The Great Decoupling. And we have a fantasy in this country that revolves around our one of our national mottos, E pluribus unum, from many one. And I say it's a fantasy because it's never been the state of play, with a couple of small exceptions in American history. And what I mean by that is if you go back pre-founding, pre 1776, pre 1787, what you find is the colonies and then the Confederate States, they didn't like each other. They were very different. They had distinct cultures. They actually had state religions. They had distinct state religions, essentially. There was a lot of infighting. You had New York and New Jersey almost go to war against each other over tariffs. So these were people who did not get along. And when you go throughout American history, what you find is we've never gotten along state to state. The cultures are diverse and different. We like to do things different ways. And the glue, the very special magic that's held the United States together, comes out of the convention in 1787. In 1787, they get in that convention and they don't like each other. They had this government under the Articles of Confederation that gave the central government no power, specifically because they didn't trust any other state to tell them what to do. And so they create the Articles of Confederation, no central power. It doesn't work. They go to 1787 to convention. They argue with each other. They yell at each other. They accuse each other of stuff. Out of that distrust and that dislike, and I would say even hatred, comes this idea of federalism. In other words, we're going to do some stuff together because we have to. There are existential threats in the world. At the time, England still an existential threat. I would argue France, who was our largest creditor, was still an existential threat. They would have been happy to dominate the colonies. Spain was a threat in some quarters. We had the frontiers where there were threats with indigenous people. We had to bond together. We did it under a system where we said, we'll do a few things together that we have to do. Everything else we're going to leave to the states. So you have to understand that our national foundation, this tapestry of states that were woven together with a run of thread through it that said, we don't like each other. We could do some stuff together, but most stuff we're not going to do together. So fast forward to today, and we get to this point where we're forced to do almost everything together. That's the federal government is dominant. The states were supposed to be dominant. Now the federal government's dominant. It's one size fits all. Every election is the most important election of our lifetime because we're going to elect somebody who's almost a king. We're going to give power to Congress that's going to tell us what to do. You mentioned the administrative agencies, I think largely unconstitutionally telling all of us what to do. So this is the moment in which we find ourselves where the federal government has asserted ultimate power that it was never intended to have. It's not going to work in a large, diverse nation. It's never worked well. It reached its pinnacle in the 70s. Nobody objected to big government. Here we are. And so today we find ourselves in Texas, where I live. It's absolutely untenable. The vast majority of people coming into this country, legally or illegally, is coming through Texas. You've got people in New York City complaining because, I don't know, they've got 80,000 migrants. We get that many coming through Texas per month and a lot more. I think the numbers this month are going to be around 250,000. A lot of them stay. They're destroying our towns. I have a friend who recently moved to McAllen, Texas. It's down on the border. McAllen, I would argue, is Mexico at this point. I mean, it's completely, the culture is dominated by Mexico. Everywhere you go, I can't say legal or illegal, but I would argue mostly illegal. I think even the ones that are now being allowed in by the Biden administration, technically, I still think they're illegal immigrants, illegal aliens. And that town is just, it is overrun by people like, and when I say overrun, and I'm not trying to racialize this, you see people from all over the world.
You can speak freely here, Mark. This is a safe space.
Yeah, look, but it's not racial. And this is even scarier because you see people from Eastern European countries. You see people from the Far East. And what you have is in front of convenience stores and gas stations. You got people bathing in gas station bathrooms. You've got people wandering the streets and congregating. It's becoming a third world country down there. And Texas is suffering the brunt of this. all of these people coming in. The federal government now says they're trying to draft some kind of remain in Texas policy where these people have to stay because the governor's busing them out. It is a disaster for the state of Texas. Our hospitals are overrun. Our schools are overrun. Our small
I
towns
have to point to Justin's comment. I put it on the screen. You have a drunk speaker spouting nonsense from the state house podium in Texas. What's up with that?
Look, I think that's a really important question. That's a guy by the name of Dade Phelan, and he got caught literally drunk on the floor leading the House of Representatives. He helped to kill a lot of this stuff in our last session. And so that's a great question. What's going on with the Republican Party that is quote unquote dominant in Texas that has not taken a strong enough stand against this stuff?
Well, can you talk about living there? Like, I guess I'm interested in a more of a long arc, more of a longer perspective on these things, because one element of my inquiry on a lot of these issues is one from, what is our historical memory on these topics, right? So when you make reference to people bathing in, restrooms and the decline of the infrastructure and just the general state of the culture in certain areas, that is an obvious contrast to something, right? And we've got a question in here, a comment from Imperius that is driving me to ask you this. Imperius says, we are discussing this from a presupposition that the majority of Americans want a republic. Most Americans want to be ruled and will gladly give up their freedom if they can pick up a latte at Starbucks. I disagree with that. I understand it. I certainly understand it. I disagree with that because it is bound by this moment in time so intensely. That is to ignore the fact that many of the people in my life, my elders, those who have either in my family or those who have been mentors or what have you, were reared and raised in an era in which institutions were legitimate and were considered legitimate and wielded influence and power. And whether we have a historical look back at certain transgressions and failures and shortcomings, we look away from that. There was obviously a time in this country when our institutions, as constituted, were deemed culturally to be legitimate, right? And there was a standard of living, there was an expectation, and individuals strove for dignity in a lot of respects, right? There was a self-reliance theme and motif that survived through that manifest destiny period and the transcendentalist writers and made its way and permeated largely. It took root in Texas. I think I told Adam yesterday, I've never spent any real time in Texas, and I was raised in North Carolina, and yet I understand what Texas is to our founding documents, right? I understand the patina of that vintage American spirit that lives in Texas and is a part of nearly everything that it does, which is what makes this case of the immigration crisis in our southern border so important to me, because Texas is sort of like the Alamo of the entire United States from that perspective, right? If we do not pay attention to what Texas is showing us now, there isn't a whole lot of retreat positions with respect to preserving our republic, right? And those ideals that our federal government is supposed to be supporting. So can you talk a little bit about being a lawyer in Texas, living in Texas, and where you are now, what your outlook is?
Yeah, so I think I fit right in there. I have to say to your commenter, I agree and disagree. So I'm kind of in the middle. I think we have educated a generation of citizens who don't know what a republic is, or uneducated, or failed to educate, however you want to say it. And so I think there is some truth to that. I see it as I travel around the country. I would argue the majority still understand. A lot of us, I say us, broadly speaking, not me, but a lot of us have kept silent about what we believe because we're now being punished for speaking up on what we believe. I'm a refugee. I left California. California used to be what Texas is today, and what Texas is losing now. California was the golden state. It was the place where people went to achieve their dreams. It was a state that did not have a heavy regulatory burden, did not have a heavy tax burden. It was a state where people were free to be what they wanted to be. And some of the other states looked down on California because that's where all the crazy people went to do the crazy things. That's where our space industry was really born, was in California. That's obviously the culture was born in California, the movie industry, the music industry. California's lost all of that sheen. And a lot of it went to Texas. And I agree with you. I went to Texas because I wanted to be free. I mean, it sounds crazy, but I wanted to live in a place where people believed in the values of freedom. I wanted to live in a place where my neighbors went to church. I wanted to live in a place where they weren't trying to take all my money through taxation. All of those things are what my family was seeking. I left when my kids were old enough that they had flown the nest, and I never wanted them to come back to California. So I wanted to plant my roots somewhere where there was freedom, where my kids would have opportunity. And I chose Texas. I would say, had I known what was going to happen, I might have chose somewhere else, because the patina is coming off of Texas, and immigration is a big part of that. But the left is pushing hard in Texas. They want to turn Texas blue. They want to turn Texas into California. And this is really interesting to me, Michael. It's anti-federalist. There's a great book by a professor at George Mason, Greva. It's called The Upside Down Constitution. And he talks about cartelized federalism. This was a new concept to me. And it's the idea that states that are heavy regulatory burden states, New York, New Jersey, Illinois, states like this get together and they try to get the federal government to impose one size fits all regulations that match their regulations, because otherwise they're not competitive. So if they can get the federal government to force California style regulations on Texas, well, then California can compete with Texas. But otherwise they can't. So we've got a federalism now that was originally designed so that the states would push back against the federal government. Now we've got a bunch of states asking the federal government to impose broad regulatory burdens on the states. It's not something that the framers ever anticipated. But me being here in Texas, living in Texas, with all the bad stuff going on, I have to say it's 95% better than California. There's really no comparison. You feel the freedom in the air. You talk to a lot of people publicly who believe the way we believe. Even the left in Texas, they're not vicious like I found the left in California. You can sit down and have a beer with somebody on the left and have some tacos and have a great time and argue politics, and people don't hate on each other like what you see in some of the really blue states.
Yeah, Imperius is still in the YouTube chat, and there's a certain cynicism to the point about the public consciousness on this issue. I think what I'm taking issue with, I guess, from the perspective of, people don't care, they want to be ruled. I understand where that's coming from. Again, I'm not ignorant to why one would say that. And
Right.
there is a natural bell curve of where most people sit in the fat part of the bell curve, where they are content to, go to work Monday through Friday. And this is not a jab at that, by the way. But most people do not necessarily want to be an advocate. Most people do not want to put themselves in a position of risk. Most people are relatively risk averse. And my point is simply that the alarm has finally gone off for many people who spent most of their lives believing in the legitimacy of the institutions that governed their day-to-day lives, state and federal. Right. And Norm is a prime example of that, in my opinion. It has taken him quite literally working for 4 months in the trial defending Joe Biggs from charges of seditious conspiracy in connection with the events of January 6, 2021, to become clear-headed on the nature of Merrick Garland's DOJ. And why is that? Well, and Norm may not be the best example because of how much he has invested into the system over the course of his career. But if you use that as an example, you can easily see why it would take longer for there to be some sort of corresponding and proportionate push back on a lot of the policies and implementation of what's going on, because number one, people don't want to believe that things are as bad as they are. That's just the natural human condition, right? And then number two, it takes a second to mobilize and make efficacious moves to do something without also being put in jail, because the natural human predisposition is it trends towards violence, not diplomacy, not towards organizing in second, third, and fourth order strategy and deployment, right? And so those things take time. Texas is, like you said, I think that the heart and soul of the concept of that free spirit, et cetera, it lives in Texas.
Absolutely.
But we are seeing, I think, an opportunity for remedy over those excesses of the federal government. So let's talk quickly, because we have gone more than the time that I asked you to stay. I want to talk about what.
I'll stay as long as you like, Michael. I love this.
Let's talk about what Convention of the States is doing. So I'm putting that on the screen. The Article 5 convention. You've got millions of signatures on this at this point, and many big name political brands, I would say. I even saw Vivek Ramaswamy's name down there in support of the Article 5 convention. What is that, right? What is Article 5 of the United States Constitution, and what does it mean? And then we'll talk about specifically what sorts of limitations on federal power that we expect to create once we have reached the threshold.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that most people don't know about this. And I would argue even today, I've been doing this 10 years, most people don't know about it. Most freedom-loving people don't know about it. Article 5 is the place in the Constitution where we get our power to amend the document. The first clause of Article 5 says that whenever 2/3 of the members of both houses of Congress want to propose amendments, they can propose those. They send them out to the states for ratification. It takes 3/4 of states to ratify. It's just the state legislatures involved, not the governors involved in ratification. The second way, it was put in the Constitution at the very end of the convention in 1787. Colonel George Mason from Virginia stood up and he said, "We have a big problem with the document we've created. We gave the power to Congress to propose amendments, but we didn't give it to the people acting through the states." And he asked a question: are we so naive, so stupid that we believe that a federal government that becomes a tyranny will propose amendments to restrain its own tyranny? We know what the men in convention thought because Madison's notes say nin com. There's no debate at that point. They all realize the states are going to have to restrain the federal government at some point, and it is unanimously adopted to give us that power. And so the second clause says that whenever 2/3 of the state legislatures decide they want to gather in convention to propose amendments, they can do that. We've never done that in American history, which is extraordinary. I think the framers would be horrified by that. The federal government's grown out of control. We have this remedy. It doesn't require a governor. It doesn't require Congress. It doesn't require the president. It doesn't require the courts. We have a mechanism to route around a tyrannical federal government to restrain their tyranny. And so far, it takes 34 states to call. So far, 19 states have made that call. And so we're well past the halfway mark. And the goal is to get in convention and to propose amendments that impose term limits on the federal government. That's Congress, but it's also the deep state, staffers and bureaucrats. The goal is to impose fiscal restraints on the federal government. They can't just keep spending us into oblivion. Eventually, it's going to crash. And then the final goal is the most important, to bring it full circle, is to impose federalism on the federal government, to say, no, you can't be involved in education or energy or healthcare or environment. All of these things, all of these departments where you make your living by toiling away against these agencies.
I would love for that not to be the case, by the way.
I know you would. Look, everybody I know fighting the administrative state. My son is a lawyer for America First Legal. That's what they do, right? They're fighting back against this gigantic federal beast. All of them would be happy to quit doing that and go do something else if we could get rid of that beast. And I think we can. It takes the people rising up, which is what I love about it. That's what it's supposed to be. Regular people who say, I'm going to engage, I'm going to fight. Millions of them have signed the petition. We have over 5 million people, supporters nationally. We have people in every single state legislative and congressional district in the country. The fight's on. So for your viewer, the person in the chat who's, basically said all hope is lost, as a guy that travels the country doing this, I can tell you all hope is not lost. There are way more people like you in the chat than you could possibly know. They're everywhere you go. They're in San Francisco. They're in Manhattan. They're right here in Texas, as you would expect, but they're everywhere. And I think we're going to win this fight.
Well, and that's what I love. I've talked explicitly on this stream about how much admiration I have for Vivek's platform, like the things that he has said out in the open. And one is that that America needs a spiritual revival, right? That truth is an objective thing, but there is an awakening yet to be had within the spirit of the youth, I believe, right? Younger people. And I think, Imperius, that's most likely who you're referring to when you are saying that most Americans would rather be X, Y, or Z. Listen, I have plenty complaints about young people who are of suitable age who just don't care to get a driver's license. They don't necessarily understand what the freedom of movement ultimately means, right? And what there is for them to explore. It represents mentally something that has been restricted for them in real space, right? That's a product of their upbringing and culture right now, society and culture right now. Nothing else, the same thing with there being a difficulty in finding help as an entrepreneur, right? Finding not necessarily competent help, willing and energetic help is on the decline. And from my perspective, it's finding people who are willing to swim around in the uncertainty and just do something, right? Rather than looking for a form for everything. Well, where are the instructions, or is there a form for this? There's an attorney that I've worked with before who's famously said that, he almost had a heart attack when one of his new associates came into his office one day saying, "Hey, I know I'm working on this. Do you guys have a form for that?" He said he almost jumped out of his top floor window, right? Thinking like, what have we done in hiring you? And what would have led you to the point where you come into my office as the managing partner asking if there's a form for your job? And so I acknowledge that is a crisis, but that's not to say that there isn't a hunger for purpose and fulfillment, and that there isn't a I don't want to use the big R term, revolution, in the same way that Vivek does, but he does say close the border,
right?
Deport illegal immigrants, right? No messing around. Get rid of the H-1B visa program. He talks about these things really explicitly. And that, to me, you got a very young, successful, legally trained, nearly a billionaire saying all of these things that would impact the spirit and the mind of the young people that we need to really kind of refresh the browser on the United States Constitution. And the Convention of the States, to me, is a perfect platform for that, because it is a diplomatic means. It is a constitutionally authorized means, but it is so far away from the concept of like a civil war and these things that a lot of I guess center right, more populist platforms seem to be limited by, right? That there isn't a standing knowledge that there is a mechanism within the Constitution that is designed specifically to address the ills of what we talk about when we say that America is in the midst of a legitimation crisis, right? It's institutions, education institutions, government institutions across the board have gone to excess. What certain things for you, Mark, are priorities when you think about amendments that would be made? Because I don't want to take for granted that you must reach that 34 threshold and it will take 38 states to ratify the amendments. But what to you seem to be the most important ones that would be pushed forward almost as like, first, second, third, maybe, or first, second?
Yeah. So I would say there's a distinction between what Mark's fantasy would be about what I would want to see happen and what I think legitimately will happen. So I'm going to start with just my kind of end game fantasy, if I could. There's two that I think would be most important if we could get them done. First would be the repeal of the 17th Amendment, which is the direct election of senators. That was so incredibly destructive to our checks and balances in our system. Look, I would argue most people, maybe even some people listening to this, wouldn't know that we used to have our senators appointed by the state legislatures. By the way, I didn't know this as an attorney, even after law school. I had no idea that was the history. We didn't study the Constitution in law school. This is super embarrassing to say, Michael. We never read the Constitution in law school. We read cases.
I don't even want to talk about how arduous my con law class was 1L year. It was as if there wasn't a Constitution.
That's correct. I had somebody ask me once, did you read the Constitution in law school? I was insulted by the question because it's so stupid. Of course we didn't. I thought when I started to think about it. And so I didn't know this. So the 17th Amendment says that we're going to elect our senators in a popular election in a state. And why that broke the balance so badly is because those senators were appointed by the state legislatures originally to represent the state as an entity, not to represent the people. The House was where we had our representation, but the states as entities, this is part of federalism. And that you talked about this. This is where the states had some authority and some say over the federal government. And the main thing a senator was supposed to do is say no. The federal government would usurp state power, and the state would say no. Our senators would vote no. Had they voted yes, they would have been recalled from Washington, D.C. But once we changed that balance, this is in 1913, by the way, height of the progressive era, Woodrow Wilson, and we gutted their power and we changed their incentive. So now their incentive of a United States senator is for power to be in D.C., not in their state capital. So that's one. I don't think we can do that, to be fair, because I don't think the American people are going to give up their right to vote for their senators. It sounds anti-democratic. It's a good thing to do, but I just don't think that's going to happen right now. The second one that I would love to see happen that is maybe a bridge too far, maybe we can get it done, is we have this little thing in the Constitution called the Commerce Clause. And the Commerce Clause says the federal government has the power to regulate interstate commerce. It was intended to be a very small grant of power to the federal government to prevent trade wars. I mentioned those trade wars earlier, right? These are the wars between New Jersey and New York over tariffs, and they were intended to prevent that stuff. And so that was it. It was just to smooth out tariff wars. And now all of these agencies that you fight against every day are authorized, quote unquote, by expanded interpretation of the Commerce Clause, by saying that commerce is anything, and anything that affects commerce in any way can be regulated by the federal government. So I'd love to see some kind of limitation on the federal government's power under the Commerce Clause.
I could not agree more. And it's like we've got the Commerce Clause, and then we have the dormant Commerce Clause. So we have the negative implications clause, in other words. But what I would love for people to just be conscious of is the fact that digitizing banking and then the federal involvement in our banking system is the clear issue with respect to the application of the Commerce Clause. So, for example, easy example, states out west have, in Colorado, and to a certain extent in Florida as well now, have legalized marijuana, right? Recreational use of marijuana. Now, wherever you stand personally on that, set that aside for purposes of this example. Everybody who is doing business in the recreational industry of marijuana is, from a federal perspective, violating federal law, right? The Controlled Substances Act says that marijuana is illegal, period, right? Banks who deal in cash that has a direct nexus to that unlawful activity is how the Commerce Clause applies to allow federal agents. Ultimately, even if someone never leaves a state with what they do, right? There's the channels and instrumentalities, the downstream effects that they can argue, but ultimately the banking issue is the problem. And the more that we move to a centralized, digitized system, the less that people on the ground are able to interact freely. So even if we have a position on something as a state, right? If a state decides that this is okay within its state boundaries, right, and the people there are okay with it and build toward it, where does the federal government get off ultimately interceding in that, right? And so this is not me advocating for legalization of marijuana. I think I'm probably on the other side of that if we're completely honest. But it is an easy example because we always think about crypto and decentralization, digitization of currency. But when I started showing up to my grocery store, Mark, and seeing that there was a coin shortage during COVID, I'm like, what is this about? Right? Like that's kind of scary. A coin shortage. Try to use exact cash. Coin shortage. We're not going to make change encouraging people to spend using their plastic card. That's troubling to me, but ultimately something as simple as the Commerce Clause can be, I guess, pointed to as the ultimate threat when it comes to that kind of stuff. And we've seen unpopular people on the political right debanked in the last several years, right? We've seen that sort of economic martyrdom, right, of sorts. We've seen people have to search out and become independently networked and really understand what that means. Right? It's scary stuff. So I think that would probably be my number one is the Commerce Clause, Norm.
Yeah, I'd love to see it happen. I think if you could do it the way that I would want to do it, which is go back to something akin to the original interpretation, I would say somewhere between 40 and 60% of the federal government goes away. Then there's literally no authority for its existence. And I know this is your practice area, so I love talking about this. I am an absolute hardcore opponent of the administrative state. Mm-hmm. We're not represented there. Congress throws up their hands and say, hey, there's nothing we can do about this because that's an agency determination. Everything was supposed to be, all lawmaking authority was supposed to be through Congress. And now Congress, they do what they call enabling legislation. Most people don't realize this. They're not making any of the laws that we live under. They say, oh, as the secretary shall determine. We want you to regulate the environment as the secretary shall so determine. I'm being overly broad, but that's generally the kind of grants of authority we're dealing with. And so Congress can claim they don't have any authority over this, or they have no control over what these agencies are doing. The agencies themselves largely experience no oversight. It's a very dangerous situation.
That's
So I think we need
absolutely
to fix that. So then I would say here are the ones that I think are going to get done. I would say for sure if we get in convention, there's going to be some form of a balanced budget amendment. The American people, about 85% of them polled over the last 30 years, want some form of a balanced budget amendment. I think it needs to be tied to tax and spending caps. And maybe those things are tied to gross domestic product or to population plus inflation. We can't continue to spend trillions of dollars we don't have. What can't continue won't continue. When the crash comes, I don't know. Could be tomorrow, could be 20 years from now, but the crash is coming if we don't stop this. So that's one. We can impose generally accepted accounting principles on the federal government. I think that's likely. They don't account according to any principles you or I understand. They set their own accounting principles. I would say another one would be anything that would impose term limits on Congress. People want that, again, an 85% issue. Term limits on staffers and bureaucrats, that's probably an 85% issue. And then getting back to the core issue is federalism, is saying to the federal government, here are the things you may not be involved in. And I think there's a whole bunch of them. The EPA should never have existed, Department of Energy, Health and Human Services. I would argue USDA, FDA, DEA, all of these things are creations under the Commerce Clause. And we could literally say, under the scope and jurisdiction part of our convention, these things are outside your jurisdiction. These things belong to the states. The country would be a lot healthier if we return the power to the states. Now, I do hear the argument all the time, well, but the federal government, regulates some important things, nuclear energy, for example, or the environment, for example. We can argue about whether those things should be regulated, but the reality is every state regulates that stuff themselves anyway. And so we can return all that stuff to the states. We'd have a much healthier system.
Yeah, it seems like a pendulum, right? It does seem as though that this issue of federalism and anti-federalism, that growth of federal government and contraction, obviously I have never lived in a time in America when the federal government was at all limited, and I've only experienced the world through the lens of the growing impact and reach of the federal government. But it does seem to me as though if Convention of States is successful, and if we as a country are successful in limiting the scope and impact of the federal government, that there will come a time when people want the federal government to step in and unify around certain things again. Because to the way that we talk about this right now is easy to forget that some of these things were formed when there wasn't a precedent for solving certain things, like a big corporation dumping waste into wetlands and stuff like that, right? There are issues that we can point at historically where the solution, the simplest, quickest solution was to do certain things in terms of organizing and delegating and then putting people over there. People, retire out of Congress. The succession planning doesn't include accountability for things that they've created. And then here we are 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years later, right, with iterations and bastardizations of what were once benevolent and effective public policy objectives behind it. I think my main issue with the administrative state is necessarily that in advocating for individual clients, that these agencies, and many people wouldn't want to believe this, but there are administrative codes and statutes on par for nearly everything that an administrative agency is supposed to wield in terms of its jurisdiction and power and remedy and process. But most often is the case is there are internal protocols that are not written down, and they are handling issues internally as a team, just depending on what the composition of that team is, where and how they see fit. Right. And that in and of itself is a huge discoverable issue when it comes to advocating in a court of law. But here's the rub. Who in the private sector, the average business in the private sector, does not wield litigation resources. It is not. So how are we to really get remedy other than benefactors on the outside who would support some sort of constitutional or civil rights or due process lawsuit against a state agency, and then imperious, this will satisfy you, to look and pierce the qualified immunity, that veil that guards the individual agents who are making these arbitrary and capricious and otherwise erroneous decisions, but are never held accountable for it, right? And this could go for hours, Mark, because layered on top of that is ultimately the stuff about basically the impossibility of terminating people within that administrative apparatus, whether at the state or federal level, right? Just the employment standards around that, the difficulty in removing people for being ineffective or incompetent at their jobs is sort of the force multiplier that sits atop a lot of that. So anyway, Mark, we have gone for a full hour here, and I want to thank you for being so generous with your time. I will shut up, but please, you are at Mark Meckler on X. It is at COS Project, and all of that is in the description to the video. At COS Project on X as well. Is it conventionofstates.com that I had?
That's correct. Yep.
Conventionofstates.com. Mark, what else before we get out of here?
Yeah, the last thing I would say is for those who are watching, that it's not on me, it's not on Michael, it's on all of us. And if we don't engage, if you're not engaged, if all you're doing is watching this or listening to this, that's not enough. And you're going to have to step up and get into the fight. And you have to ask yourself, what's this nation worth to you? What's this experiment in liberty, this great idea of the United States worth to you? And you're probably not even going to benefit from what you're willing to fight. So the question is, do you understand your duty? John Quincy Adams said something that I really love. He said, duty is ours, results belong to God, meaning he was going to fight for what he believed, no matter the outcome. We have to have that attitude if we're going to save this country.
I love that. Thank you for ending with that. We will be back, everybody, on Monday morning, 8 a.m. on YouTube, Rumble, X. You know how to find us if you want to catch the audio only version. And Mark, I'll share all this with you for you to pass around. The audio only version is available on Apple, Spotify, Google Play, Audible, Overcast, wherever you find podcasts. And as I said yesterday, and as I will continue to say, please go over there, leave us 5 stars and leave a positive review, or just leave us alone. You know, we're building, we got things to accomplish over here. Mark, thank you very much. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.
See you later, everybody.